Milk wasn't just milk in the Victorian world. It was comfort, status, childhood, and daily routine, all sitting in a jug on the table. And it was also one of the easiest ways for a household to get quietly unlucky. In the next 60 seconds, you'll see why this video has to be safely explained. Because before fridges and modern hygiene, milk could turn from perfect food to perfect problem faster than people like to admit. It spoiled quickly, it traveled through messy supply chains, and when things went wrong, it didn't just taste off, it could carry disease, especially in cities where demand exploded and quality control lagged behind. That's why Victorian Britain became obsessed with the milk question, not because people suddenly got fussy, but because families were trying to feed children something wholesome, while doctors and investigators were linking outbreaks to contaminated milk. So before we go any further, quick comment. Do you generally tolerate milk well, or has it always felt heavy or unsettled for you? Either answer makes sense, and it mirrors a much older truth that Victorians lived with every day. Milk is incredibly nourishing and incredibly vulnerable. Now here's the hook that flips the story. They didn't preserve milk with one miraculous trick. They used a stack of methods: cooling, separating, converting, and sometimes heating, each one buying time, changing the milk into something more stable or lowering the risk just enough to get through the day. And once you understand that stack, you start seeing the Victorian mindset everywhere. No gadgets, no magic, just practical control over time and temperature. In the next section, we'll start with the simplest part of that stack, how they created cold without electricity, because the moment you see it, you'll realize why some of their methods still show up today in the most unexpected places. The first Victorian preservation trick was never a trick. It was simply getting milk cold as fast as possible and keeping it out of warmth and sunlight, because heat is what turns a few harmless hours into a risky day. In the next couple of minutes, you'll see how they built a homemade cold chain without electricity, using nothing but location, airflow, and a bit of basic physics. Quick one for the comments. In your home, where's the coldest spot? A north-facing cupboard, a shaded utility area, a stone floor, or somewhere near a drafty window? Victorians had the same logic, just more deliberate. They relied on cool larders in pantries positioned away from the sun, often on the north side, with ventilation to keep air moving and temperatures steadier. And they treated milk like something that had to live in the coolest part of the house, not wherever there's space. They also used the simplest cooling accelerator of all: water. A jug of milk could be placed in a larger bowl of cold water to pull heat out quickly, and in some homes, the container would sit against cool stone or slate because dense surfaces stay cooler longer than warm air in a kitchen. Then there's the method that sounds almost too primitive to work, but it genuinely does, up to a point: porous earthenware and evaporative cooling. When water evaporates from a porous surface, it draws heat away, lowering the temperature of the container and its contents, which is why you still see evaporation-based cooling methods in hot climates. The important safely explained detail is this: none of these methods made milk magically safe. They mostly bought time. They slowed spoilage, they reduced the speed of bacterial growth, and they helped a household get from morning to midday. But in warm weather or with poor hygiene, that extra time could still be dangerously short. And that's why Victorians rarely relied on cooling alone. In the next section, we'll move to the real survival move. They didn't just chill milk, they split it, turning part of it into cream and butter, and turning milk that won't last into foods that could. The real Victorian survival move wasn't trying to keep milk as milk for days. It was accepting that milk is fleeting, and then turning it into things that last. In this section, you'll learn the simple, repeatable method they relied on: separation and conversion. Because once you split milk into cream, butter, and leftover milk, you gain control over time. Quick one for the comments. Have you ever seen a cream line on unhomogenized milk? That thick layer sitting on top? Or is that something you've only heard about? Victorians saw it constantly, and they treated it like free preservation. The method was almost insultingly practical. You bring the milk home, you cool it as best you can, then you pour it into a wide, shallow pan in the coldest part of the house and leave it undisturbed. Over time, the fat rises and forms a richer top layer. Then you skim it carefully, not stirring, not shaking, just lifting the cream off the surface with a ladle or spoon, keeping it clean, keeping it covered, and using it quickly. That cream is already more stable than the original milk because you've concentrated the fat and reduced the watery portion that spoils fastest. And it also becomes a gateway to foods that keep longer. The next step is butter. And butter is basically Victorian time travel. You take cream, you agitate it, with a churn if you have one, or simply a jar you can shake hard. And eventually it breaks, meaning the fat clumps together into butter while the liquid separates out as buttermilk. Then comes the part that separates people who make butter for fun from people who make butter to survive. You wash and work it. You rinse the butter in clean, cold water and knead it gently to push out remaining buttermilk, because that leftover liquid is what turns butter rancid faster. And if you're thinking like a Victorian, you salt it, because salt helps it keep and makes it more forgiving. Now you've taken something fragile and turned it into something you can store in a crock, wrap, or keep cool for far longer than milk would ever allow, especially if your kitchen isn't constantly warm. And nothing is wasted. The buttermilk isn't leftovers, it becomes a baking ingredient: pancakes, soda bread, scones. And the skimmed milk can be used sooner for porridge, tea, or cooking, with the understanding that it's on a clock. This is also where Victorian households quietly used another trick without calling it science: controlled souring. If milk was going to turn anyway, letting it sour cleanly and using it in cooking could be safer and more useful than pretending it would stay fresh, because sour milk behaves differently in recipes and doesn't require you to drink it straight. But, and here's the safely explained line you need to hear, none of this guarantees safety the way modern refrigeration and pasteurization do. These methods buy time and reduced waste. I don't magically remove contamination from a bad supply. Which is why in the next section, we'll talk about the moment Victorians needed milk to be as safe as possible, especially for children, and why heat, in the form of scalding or early pasteurization-style practices, became the closest thing to a true safety upgrade before the fridge. In the Victorian world, cooling and separating bought you time. But when you needed milk to feel genuinely safer, especially for children, the closest thing to a real upgrade was heat. In this section, you'll learn what scalded milk actually meant in practice, why it helped, and why it still wasn't a perfect shield. Quick comment. Have you ever heard an older relative mention boiled milk or scalded milk like it was normal, almost routine? That habit has deep roots because long before fridges, people noticed something simple. When milk was heated properly, it didn't turn as quickly and it was less likely to upset you. The logic is straightforward, even if Victorians didn't phrase it in microbiology. Heat reduces the living load in the liquid, meaning fewer organisms are left to multiply into trouble. And once you start thinking like that, you can see why households and institutions began treating milk less like a fresh drink and more like something that could be managed with a process. You'd hear about milk being heated for infants, for the sick, for households that couldn't risk a bad batch, and you'd see a growing awareness that cleanliness mattered as much as temperature. A perfectly heated milk poured into a dirty jug is still a gamble because recontamination happens fast. That's the safely explained line I want to keep crystal clear. Heat can reduce risk, but it can't magically fix a filthy supply chain, and it can't undo contamination that happens after the heating step. This is also the period where the bigger idea starts to surface publicly, the notion that milk isn't inherently pure just because it looks white. As medical knowledge advanced, people began linking disease to milk more directly, and debates kicked off around whether heating milk should be standard, not just a household choice. That's where pasteurization enters the story as a concept, controlled heating designed to make milk safer, scaled beyond a single kitchen. But adoption was slow, uneven, and controversial because you're asking an entire society to change something intimate and daily. Some people believed heated milk tasted worse. Others distrusted the process or used it as an excuse not to fix the filth at the source. And many simply couldn't afford the time, equipment, or consistent routine to do it properly. Meanwhile, families did what families always do. They mixed methods. They cooled milk to slow it down. They separated cream to use it quickly. They turned dairy into butter to extend usefulness. And when risk felt high, they used heat as a protective step, not as a guarantee, but as a reduction of the odds. And that's the key. Victorian safety was often about probability, not perfection. Today we have pasteurization standards and refrigeration, so you don't need to gamble the way they did, and you absolutely shouldn't treat historical home methods as a substitute for modern food safety. But understanding their logic matters because it reveals the real villain of the era. It wasn't a lack of a fridge, it was the messy, inconsistent system that brought milk from cow to city with too many chances to go wrong. Which raises the obvious question: if heat helped and people were clearly worried, why didn't it become universal much sooner? That's what we'll unpack in the next section, because the answer isn't science, it's economics, trust, and a supply chain that was far dirtier than most people wanted to admit. If Victorian milk was risky, it wasn't because people were ignorant or careless. It was because the system behind milk was, for a long time, built for speed and profit, not cleanliness and consistency. In this section, you'll understand why doing everything right at home still wasn't always enough, and why reform took so frustratingly long. Quick comment: if you had to choose, what would you trust more? A method that makes milk last longer, or a method that makes milk safer? Because that tension sits at the center of the Victorian story. In big cities, demand for milk grew fast, and supply chains stretched. Milk traveled farther, sat longer, and passed through more hands, which meant more opportunities for contamination, dilution, and simple mishandling. And because milk looks innocent, people wanted to believe it was naturally pure, even when evidence kept pointing the other way. That's why milk scandals became such a thing. Not just bad batches, but a recurring public fear that something essential had become unreliable. Add to that the brutal reality that milk is a product you can quietly tamper with, watered down, skimmed, or mixed, and you end up with a market where trust matters as much as temperature. Meanwhile, the science was evolving. Investigators were increasingly linking outbreaks and illness to contaminated milk, and medical voices were warning that the danger wasn't only sourness, it could be invisible. But knowledge doesn't instantly become policy, especially when the fix costs money. For a supplier, better hygiene, better handling, better storage, and heat treatment all mean investment, time, and oversight. And if your competitors aren't forced to do it too, you risk pricing yourself out. That's one reason change drags. The good option isn't always the cheapest option. Another reason is taste and tradition. People argued about what proper milk should be. Some distrusted heated milk or thought it was inferior. Others saw pasteurization as covering up dirty practices instead of fixing the farm and dairy conditions. And some reform efforts genuinely did run into that problem. If you rely on heat alone and ignore hygiene, you're treating symptoms while leaving the disease in place. Then there's the uncomfortable truth about regulation. It arrives unevenly. Different areas move at different speeds, enforcement varies, and public habits don't change overnight. Families still needed milk daily, so they made do with whatever they could access, and they built household workarounds: cooling, separation, butter making, scalding, not because those were perfect solutions, but because they were the only tools available inside the home. This is why the Victorian milk story often feels like two worlds at once. On one side, you've got households becoming more clever and practical. On the other, you've got a supply chain that could undo their best efforts with one contaminated delivery. And that's the moment where this video earns its title, because the only responsible takeaway is not copy their method and you'll be fine. The responsible takeaway is understand the logic, copy the safe principles, and avoid the risky assumptions. In the next section, I'll give you the modern, safely explained version of the Victorian playbook, what you can copy today without gambling with your health, and what you absolutely should not copy, no matter how charming it sounds. Right, let's land this safely, because the Victorian milk methods are fascinating, but you're not watching this to cosplay the 1890s and gamble with your stomach. You're watching because there's a practical mindset here you can copy today. Control time, temperature, and cleanliness, and be honest about what each method can and cannot do. In this final section, I'll give you the Victorian playbook in a modern, responsible form: what to copy, what to avoid, and why. A quick comment: would you rather waste a little food or risk a bad batch? Because the safest people always choose the boring answer. First, what you can copy is the physics of cooling, not as a replacement for refrigeration, but as a way to protect quality. If you ever need to transport milk or you're putting groceries away, the principle is simple: keep it cold, minimize time at room temperature, and store it in the coldest, most stable part of the fridge, not in a warm door shelf that swings up and down all day. Second, copy the Victorian obsession with clean containers. Milk is unforgiving. If your bottle, jug, or lid is dirty, you're effectively giving bacteria a head start, so treat the container as part of the food. Third, copy the idea of converting dairy quickly into longer-lasting forms, not because you need to survive without a fridge, but because it reduces waste and gives you control. Using cream promptly, making butter, or using cultured dairy products the way people historically did can still be practical and enjoyable today with modern hygiene and safe ingredients. Now, what you should not copy is the dangerous assumption that if it smells fine, it's fine, or that a traditional home method makes milk safe in the way modern standards do. Cooling and separation buy time, they don't neutralize contamination. And while heating milk at home can reduce risk, it's not a universal safety guarantee. It depends on doing it properly, keeping it clean afterwards, and most importantly, starting with milk that's already produced under safe conditions. That's the core message of Safely Explained. Victorian households were clever, but they were also living with risks we've deliberately engineered out of modern life through pasteurization, refrigeration, and regulation. And the smart move is to enjoy the history without resurrecting the hazards. So if you take one rule from this video, take this. Use Victorian logic for handling and waste reduction, but rely on modern food safety for actual protection. And once you notice that Victorian pattern, solving daily problems with simple physics, clever mechanics, and zero electricity, you start seeing it everywhere around the house, which is why in the next video, 12 Victorian household tools that worked without electricity, we're going to tour the genius little devices they use to wash, clean, measure, ventilate, and cook. Tools that look old-fashioned, but still beat modern gadgets in the one way that matters: they always work.